From east to west, 535 miles across. From the south, 275 miles north to the Canadian border. For a long time, these distances limited Montana's growth. We had to drive our cattle overland, 273 miles to Bismarck, North Dakota, 570 to Granger, Wyoming. We sent our gold out on wagons driving 10 up. 20 mule teams labored overland through rocky passes. Slow going. Steamboats carried fur and wool out of Fort Benton and down 1,200 miles to St. Louis.
But the rivers, the big ones, were open only a few months each year. Ice and mud clogged them most of the time. The problem of transportation held back population growth. For Montana to get any bigger, the distances had to get smaller. In the late 19th century, there was only one way to do that: build a railroad. A citizen of Helena expressed the national mania for building railroads when he said, "Every blow which you strike will be remembered as a blow for freedom, freedom from isolation and the oppression of colonial government."
The first transcontinental railroad bypassed Montana entirely. But even before the Union Pacific joined the Central Pacific in 1869, Congress issued the charter for another transcontinental railroad. The Northern Pacific would link Lake Superior with the Pacific Ocean in Washington. Congress wouldn't fund construction of the railroad, but it did give the Northern Pacific the largest land grant in history. 44 million acres, 17 million acres in Montana alone. Those acres would bring wealth to the empire builders and the speculators. They would also bring people with families. The first to come, though, were the work crews. With them, they brought their own complete town, Terminus. Temporary and portable, Terminus had just about everything: merchants, freight haulers, saloons, even a post office. Terminus was the end of the line. When the crews moved, the town moved. Lock, stock, and post office. Dillon was one terminus town that stayed put. It was no accident. It began when a rival railroad company decided to beat the Northern Pacific into the heart of the silver mines. In 1872, a group of Mormon investors began pushing a spur north from the Union Pacific's line at Ogden, Utah. The narrow gauge line of the Utah Northern stalled in Franklin, Idaho 2 years later. Construction didn't begin again until 1878. That's when Jay Gould, financier for the Union Pacific, bought up the Utah Northern. Now called the Utah and Northern, the line slowly progressed from Franklin. It crossed into Montana on March 9, 1880. The rail terminus moved from Big Sheep Creek to Red Rock in Montana. It looked like nothing would stop the line between Red Rock and Butte, but a stubbornly rebellious rancher stopped the Utah and Northern near the junction of the Beaverhead River and Blacktail Deer Creek. Richard Deacon didn't want the railroad crossing his ranch. Rather than lose his land through the railroad's power of eminent domain, Deacon tried to make a deal. He offered to sell the Utah and Northern his 480 acres for $8,000. Jay Gould would never agree to that. So the railroad convinced the merchants of Terminus to buy up Deacon's land. In return, the railroad promised to stay at the new terminus over the winter.
This meant the merchants would have a permanent home for at least 6 months. Business, including freight, would come to the terminus, especially since it was the only rail line into the entire state. Although Deacon upped his price to $10,000, the merchants paid. It was a good risk. They made back their investment in less than 1 day. They held an auction and quickly sold prime business sites. They named the town Dillon after Union Pacific President Sidney Dillon, and the Utah and Northern officially terminated there in October 1880. When the terminus packed up the next spring, Dillon should have packed up as well. After all, the previous terminus, Red Rock, became a corpse in 2 weeks after the work crew left. But the people in Dillon were enterprising. They agitated to move the seat of Beaverhead County from Bannock to Dillon. They petitioned the state legislature. They formed groups and planned strategies.
The town's businessmen issued a statement to the community that spring. Citizens and taxpayers, it began, have you not long enough paid tribute to the little ring of office seekers at Bannock? Has your money not been squandered long enough by paying for brick courthouses built in inaccessible parts, mileage fees by the thousands of dollars, and in supporting a clique of chronic hangers-on who, by reason of their isolation, are enabled to hide from the public gaze? That May, voters went to the polls and made Dillon the county seat. Although the terminus moved on, the town of Dillon remained, and Bannock became a ghost town.
The railroads created many such ghost towns. If a line passed a mile or two outside a community, the town withered or died, and a new town grew on the line. Billings developed that way, and Colson died. The 50 residents of Colson fully expected the Northern Pacific to pass through their town. They were situated on the Yellowstone River at a ferry crossing. They had a post office and a telegraph line, a hotel, and several saloons.
Colson was the first town outside of Indian land on the rail line. It was a natural place for a division point. But due to a peculiarity in the Northern Pacific's land grant, and due to the economic schemes of some wealthy individuals, the railroad chose a site 2 miles west of Colson. Normally, the land grant gave the railroad alternate sections along the line, but at Billings, 2 sections lay on both sides of the line. This meant the town could grow in 2 directions. A group of developers promoted the township and named it Billings. In 1869, Frederick Billings bought a 1/12 interest in the Northern Pacific. Almost 20 years later, he became the company's president. He retired from Northern Pacific in 1881, but as one of the largest stockholders, he remained influential. His support of a group of investors, led by Herman Clark, helped the group get the township site moved from Colson. The investors began with a $200,000 stake. They quickly made back their stake and then some by advertising city lots and farmland back east. Whole blocks were sold in Chicago and New York, according to one writer. But the paradise on the prairie was actually built on an alkali flat. Water had to be hauled from the Yellowstone. At 50 cents a barrel, it was at a premium. Fire was an ever-present danger. By 1882, though, Billings had 500 residents. Civic-minded citizens, they began trying to solve some of the city's problems.
And Colson vanished. The people left it for Billings. And the town itself, its buildings, its streets, disappeared without a trace.
Of all the big-time railroad success stories, and there were many, the biggest was that of Jim Hill. Hill transformed a series of branch lines connecting St. Paul with Manitoba into a transcontinental railway. The Manitoba, it was called then, reached Minot, North Dakota in 1886. Hill was anxious to get a line through to Montana's mines and farms. The next year, his crew began working westward from Minot. They averaged 3¼ miles per day. It was a breakneck, back-breaking pace. An officer at Great Northern, as it was soon called, described their incredible speed. Our line was built from near Minot, North Dakota, to Great Falls, 545 miles in 1887, and this went through Glasgow, Saco, Malta, Haarlem, Chinook, and Havre to a point 4 miles west of Havre, and then southward to Great Falls. Jim Hill's High Line cut right across Indian land. For a time, President Cleveland resisted pressure to give Hill the right-of-way, but eventually he got limited access. In Montana, he didn't get the vast tracts earlier builders got. Instead, 75 feet on either side of the track and small station plots every 10 miles. Still, it was enough to open up a part of the state that had seen no development. Later on, Jim Hill would promote the High Line to the homesteaders. For now, though, he wanted a transcontinental railroad. So the Great Northern pushed westward, over Marias Pass, and on out to the Pacific. Like an octopus, Jim Hill expanded his empire still further. In 1895, he and J.P. Morgan gained control of the Northern Pacific. In 1901, he bought up the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy. The Burlington was an important line. It connected Billings with Chicago.
The United States Supreme Court finally stopped Jim Hill. Nobody else could. It prevented the merger of the Great Northern, the Burlington, and the Northern Pacific. The court ruled the monopoly violated the Sherman Antitrust Act. 65 years later, the three lines finally merged into one, the Burlington Northern. By then, the railroad successfully argued it was the only way they could survive.
One other railroad played a role in the development of Montana. In 1906, an established Midwestern carrier, the Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul, ran a line up through the Yellowstone Valley and on into the Musselshell Valley. By connecting with the Jawbone Railroad, so called because its financier, Richard Harlow, paid his men in fast talk rather than wages, the Milwaukee Road had a strong route into central Montana. The railroads brought a burst of prosperity to Montana that was different from the gold rush. The people who came were different. Not young men, but older folk. Families with brothers and sisters, aunts and uncles. They came to settle, to put down roots. More civilized, more cultured, and more middle class than the miners, they modeled themselves and their towns after urban areas. They dreamed the small communities they built would someday become big cities like Chicago and Boston.
The people who came to Montana's rail towns were far different from those who had come in the gold mining rush of the 1860s. In the first place, they came in families. Husbands and wives brought their children along, which of course had not been the case in the days of Bannock, Virginia City, and Last Chance Gulch. Not only that, but they tended to come in larger aggregate family groups. For example, a mother and father would bring their married sons and daughters, or two brothers would bring their wives and children along together. This, of course, helped in terms of harvest and planting in the agricultural areas surrounding the rail towns. The people who arrived on the railroad and jumped off at the rail towns, whether they expected to stay there in the rail town itself or move into the hinterland around the rail town, thought of themselves as staying forever. This is where they were going to put down their roots. This is where they were going to raise their children, marry the neighbors' sons or daughters. The people who had come to the mining rush, who were primarily young men, had of course thought of only staying here for a little while. It was a kind of rite of passage. Go to the Montana gold fields, stay for a few years, and then of course leave. The people who arrived in the rail towns had a much different outlook on life. They looked for permanency, and of course the railroad engendered that in them. No one was going to build a railroad and then leave it.
Silver had always been there, and miners knew it. But placer gold was easier to get, and worth more besides. As the placers dried up, miners began working the quartz veins. The veins contained precious metals, gold and silver, as well as base metals like lead and zinc. Silver required a large capital investment, however. For one thing, it was harder to extract. Special equipment and materials were needed. Stamp mills and smelters had to be built to separate silver from the quartz. Without the railroads to transport equipment to Montana's mining operations, our silver industry could not expand. Most of the silver finds were made in the 1860s and 70s. The Alta and the Comet mines, the Gregory mine, Granite Mountain. The list could go on and on. But the explosive boom didn't happen until the 1880s. In 1881, the Utah and Northern terminated in Butte, and the Northern Pacific reached Helena in 1883. The railroads brought the massive machinery needed to work the mines and took the ores down into Utah and back east to be processed. Then, when Jim Hill connected the Manitoba with the Montana Central and Great Falls, Montana miners had a direct route to markets on the East Coast. The new rail connection forced other lines to offer competitive rates. The railroads allowed the boom to happen, but federal money policy pumped it up even more. Although the world had adopted a gold standard, the United States still accepted currency in gold and silver. Aggressive silver producers had persuaded Congress to pass a series of silver purchase laws. By purchasing great quantities of silver, the government in effect subsidized the industry. With transportation out of Montana and a ready market for silver in the U.S. government, foreign investors poured money into the state. For example, the Drumlummon mine in Marysville fell into British hands in 1883. Discovered by Thomas Cruise in 1876, the Drumlummon produced $16 million in gold and silver. Silver also attracted local investors such as Anton M. Holter and Sam Hauser of Helena, and A.J. Davis of Butte. Big capital played a role in developing Montana's silver industry, but dozens of small outfits also operated profitably. At the peak of the silver boom, 2/3 of the state's active mines earned less than $100,000 a year. Only 8 mines produced more than $500,000 annually. New towns sprang up in the Silver Triangle, bounded by Helena, Butte, and Phillipsburg, Wicks, Rumsey. Other towns grew outside the triangle, Argenta, Glendale. But one town towered above the others, Butte. It began with William Farland's discovery of the Travona lead in 1875. Farland and Helena businessman John Howe borrowed money to build a mill and develop the find. When Farland defaulted on his loan, a Deer Lodge banker took over in 1876. That was William A. Clark. The same year, a veteran of the Comstock Lode in Nevada came to investigate Butte for some Utah investors. Marcus Daly found Butte rich. The investors bought the Alice mine, and Daly managed it for them. By 1889, Butte was the leader in silver lead and silver copper production, 4,000 tons of ore per day. In Anaconda, 2,500 tons a day. And in 1889, Silver Bow County produced 43% of Montana's silver. Most of the silver towns in Montana collapsed when the bottom fell out of the world silver market. Banks in New York and Montana closed their doors, and mines throughout the West shut down. In 1894, the State Inspector of Mines described the effects on Argenta. The furnaces and mills have a sort of spasmodic life. Sometimes they take a long, hopeless sleep. Silver is down, and Argenta must wait the better market for the white metal. Her 100 mines must rest and their timbers decay. Her furnaces will scarcely glow with the flowing metal until silver becomes a precious metal once more. Butte and Silver Bow survived the panic of 1893. Already, their mines were expanding copper production. But most of the silver towns faded away. Little is left to remind us of the incredible wealth. Silver did bring us one thing that survived the panic: statehood. Circumstances had been against us for a long time. In the 1860s, despite the gold rush, we didn't have the population or the stability. In the 1870s, after gold dried up, our economy was depressed. People left. The 1880s looked more promising. Indians were confined to the reservations. Gigantic cattle and sheep ranches spread throughout eastern Montana. The railroads were bringing people in and transporting our goods out. The time looked right for statehood.
Montanans were exceedingly uncomfortable with territorial government for the full quarter century between 1864 and 1889. And I think to understand that discomfort with being a territory, it's important to recall what kind of a government that was and what were the frustrations. And key among those frustrations were that the President of the United States appointed the governor of the territory of Montana, appointed the justices of the territory, appointed the secretary, that the Congress of the United States set forth the frame of that government in the Organic Act of 1864, which could be amended and which Congress did amend. That meant that Congress determined the length and frequency of legislative sessions. Congress determined the salary of governors and justices, and the federal treasury paid those salaries, as it did the pay for legislators and the amount of legislative expense that could be incurred. In addition, Congress retained the power, which it seldom used, but did for 2 sessions of 1866, 1867, to annul any or all acts of a territorial legislature. Montana could only send a non-voting delegate to the House of Representatives in Washington, and not the 2 senators that would result with statehood. The kinds of public lands that were available to a new state were not yet available to the territory of Montana. I think those were the great frustrations. Montana was unusually persistent about its moves toward statehood. Typically and properly, a state was to await the invitation of Congress to convene a convention and to draft a constitution that would be the stepping stone to statehood. But for 2 of its conventions in the territorial period, Montana acted on its own. First in 1866, and that was a very irregular convention. Acting Governor Thomas Marr simply called into being the convention of '66. The territory was only 2 years old. There were only 20,000 people in Montana. It was premature. It met briefly, rapidly produced a constitution borrowed from Western states. That constitution was not ratified by the people nor presented to Congress. It's not an important chapter in Montana constitutional history, except for the fact that it indicates that persistence of Montanans as individuals, as politicians, as newspaper writers, to push for statehood throughout the territorial period. Montana again moved on its own in 1883, but this time with more deliberation. The territorial legislature, by a joint resolution in 1883, convened a constitutional convention, and 45 delegates to that convention of 1884 met in Helena in January of 1884, deliberated for 27 days, divided into standing committees that looked at other constitutions and brought back recommendations which were debated by the full convention and adopted. That constitution was formally ratified by the people of the territory and presented to Congress with a petition for statehood. Statehood did not result in 1884. There were nearly 5 years that passed before the convention of 1889, and that was totally regular. Congress by then invited Montanans to convene a convention. 75 delegates met in Helena July 4th, 1889, to draft the Constitution that became the basis for Montana, the state.
Almost immediately, of course, after Frances Willard arrived with her temperance bandwagon, Montana was gearing up for statehood. And Frances Willard and her troops had, of course, nearly 6 years head start. And they, of course, saw an opportunity, at least one woman did, a woman by the name of Clara McAdoo, who was a real estate entrepreneur from near Billings, saw an opportunity to get suffrage into the new Constitution. And she immediately set the ball rolling with inviting Henry Blackwell to Montana. And he, of course, was associated with the Eastern women's suffrage movement, knowing full well that she just could not herself lobby with all the various con delegates. As it happened, Henry Blackwell addressed the convention, put before them not the idea of putting suffrage in the Constitution, but something which we would recognize as legislative flexibility. In other words, a simple majority at some time could decide women's suffrage should that issue ever arrive.
Despite the fiasco of our first state legislature, we were optimistic. Everyone foresaw a period of expansion and development. People in Helena believed the town might soon become the Queen City of the Rockies, and we were riding the upswing of a dynamic new industry, copper. Coupled with our new status, copper seemed to promise a new prosperity that would rival gold and silver. We look forward to the future.